The first encounter emerges from a landscape already shaped by war long before any individuals come into view. It is an environment saturated with anticipation, where fear has settled into routines and expectations, quietly directing decisions even before they are consciously made. This fear is not sudden or dramatic. It is accumulated, layered through months and years of propaganda, whispered warnings, and distant reports of violence. By the time the encounter occurs, fear has become the default lens through which the unknown is interpreted. It dictates posture, tone, and intent, narrowing the range of possible outcomes to those that feel safest, even if they are not the most truthful. In this moment, the individuals involved do not meet as people, but as projections. Uniforms, accents, and circumstance stand in for character and intention. Each side carries an invisible burden of expectation, trained to assume hostility as a matter of survival. Fear compresses complexity into simplicity, turning uncertainty into threat and caution into suspicion. The encounter is therefore not just between opposing sides, but between deeply ingrained narratives that leave little room for nuance or empathy. The atmosphere is heavy with restraint, every movement calculated to avoid vulnerability. Silence feels dangerous, yet speech feels equally risky, as though a single misstep could trigger irreversible consequences. Fear amplifies small gestures, assigning meaning where none may exist, transforming neutral actions into potential provocations. In such conditions, even hesitation can be misread as deceit, and stillness as preparation for violence. The encounter unfolds slowly, not because time allows it, but because fear insists upon it. This fear is not irrational within the context of war. It is functional, even necessary. It has been reinforced by experience and training, by stories of betrayal and sudden brutality. Yet in this first encounter, fear begins to reveal its limitations. While it sharpens alertness, it also blinds perception. It reduces individuals to categories and erases the possibility that the situation might defy precedent. The expectation of harm becomes so dominant that it obscures other signals entirely. What defines this opening moment is not action, but anticipation. The fear of what might happen exerts more influence than anything that actually does. Each side prepares mentally for violence, bracing for outcomes that feel inevitable because fear has already rehearsed them countless times. This mental rehearsal creates a sense of inevitability, as though the encounter is merely fulfilling a script written long before the participants arrived. The psychological tension is compounded by isolation. In the immediate space of the encounter, external structures of command and clarity feel distant. Decisions must be made without reassurance, relying on instincts shaped by fear rather than understanding. This isolation intensifies the sense that survival depends on preemptive judgment, that waiting too long to act could be fatal. Fear in this context masquerades as wisdom. Yet beneath this hardened exterior, fear also exposes vulnerability. It reveals how fragile certainty truly is when stripped of distance and abstraction. The closer the encounter becomes, the harder it is to maintain the illusion that the other side is purely monstrous or inhuman. Subtle contradictions begin to surface, not yet strong enough to overturn fear, but sufficient to unsettle it. The encounter forces proximity, and proximity introduces ambiguity. At this stage, however, fear still dominates. It frames the encounter as a test rather than an exchange, a moment to be endured rather than understood. Moral considerations are secondary to perceived necessity. The question is not what is right, but what is safest. Humanity, if acknowledged at all, is considered a liability. Compassion is viewed as weakness, empathy as risk. This mindset reflects the broader reality of war, where fear becomes institutionalized. It is taught, reinforced, and rewarded. Those who suppress doubt and act decisively are praised, while hesitation is discouraged. In this way, fear becomes self-sustaining, perpetuating itself through systems designed to eliminate uncertainty. The first encounter exists within this system, shaped by forces far larger than the individuals involved. The emotional weight of the moment lies in its potential rather than its outcome. There is an unspoken awareness that something irreversible could occur, that the encounter could harden into memory as either trauma or precedent. Fear amplifies this awareness, turning possibility into pressure. Every second feels consequential, even though nothing has yet changed. What makes this encounter significant is how completely fear defines its opening terms. There is no space yet for reflection, no opportunity for reinterpretation. The participants are caught in a moment where instinct overrides curiosity, where inherited assumptions drown out personal observation. The encounter is a mirror reflecting the cumulative anxieties of a world at war, distilled into a single, tense interaction. In this initial phase, fear appears absolute, unchallenged, and unquestioned. It feels justified, even protective, offering clarity in a situation that otherwise feels dangerously open-ended. Yet this clarity is false, built on simplification rather than truth. The encounter has not yet revealed its deeper meaning, but the conditions are set. Fear has established the baseline, defining what is expected, what is feared, and what is believed possible. This opening moment does not resolve anything, it merely establishes the emotional terrain. It shows how easily fear can dominate perception, shaping reality before facts have a chance to intervene. The encounter begins not with violence or understanding, but with tension suspended in uncertainty. And within that suspension lies the fragile possibility that fear, having defined the beginning, may not be able to define the end. As the encounter continues beyond its first frozen moment, fear remains present but no longer feels entirely stable. The initial assumptions that governed every movement begin to lose their rigidity, not because trust has emerged, but because reality refuses to conform perfectly to expectation. The tension does not vanish. Instead, it shifts in texture. What was once a solid wall of apprehension becomes uneven, punctured by moments that cannot be easily explained within the logic of fear alone. Time plays a subtle but decisive role in this transformation. The longer the encounter lasts without immediate violence, the more difficult it becomes to sustain the belief that hostility is inevitable. Fear depends on urgency to remain convincing, on the idea that danger is imminent and unavoidable. When that urgency stretches into prolonged uncertainty, fear begins to exhaust itself. The mind, trained to anticipate sudden action, is forced instead to sit with ambiguity, and ambiguity introduces doubt. Small details begin to assert their presence. Gestures that once would have been dismissed as tactical now appear hesitant or restrained. Expressions, posture, and tone reveal inconsistencies with the image of a purely aggressive adversary. These observations do not produce comfort, but they complicate fear's narrative. The opposing side no longer appears as a singular threat, but as a collection of individuals navigating the same uncertainty. This complication creates an internal conflict. Training and instinct insist that danger remains, that any relaxation of vigilance could be fatal. At the same time, perception suggests that the immediate threat may not align with what fear has promised. This tension between expectation and observation becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The encounter turns inward as much as outward, becoming a test of one's own assumptions as much as a measure of the other side's intent. Fear begins to show its selective nature. It highlights certain possibilities while suppressing others, privileging scenarios of violence over those of restraint or misunderstanding. As this selectivity becomes apparent, its authority weakens. The realization dawns that fear has been shaping perception as much as responding to it. This awareness does not eliminate fear, but it alters its role from unquestioned guide to one influence among many. The psychological shift is subtle and uneven. Moments of clarity are followed by renewed spikes of anxiety, as though fear resists displacement. Each unexpected pause or restrained action from the other side creates space for reconsideration, but that space is fragile, easily collapsed by a sudden movement or sound. The encounter exists in a state of oscillation, swinging between suspicion and reluctant acknowledgement. This phase is defined by uncertainty rather than fear alone. Uncertainty is more destabilizing because it lacks clear instructions. Fear tells one how to act, prepare, defend, dominate if necessary. Uncertainty offers no such clarity. It demands interpretation, judgment, and responsibility. The individuals involved must now navigate a situation that no longer fits neatly into established categories. The erosion of fear's certainty also exposes the emotional cost of maintaining it. Constant vigilance is exhausting, and the longer it is sustained without justification, the heavier it becomes. The encounter forces a confrontation with this fatigue, revealing how fear, while protective in short bursts, becomes a burden when prolonged. The mind begins to seek alternative explanations simply to relieve the strain. Context begins to reassert itself. The realization emerges that the encounter is not occurring in isolation, but within a broader war shaped by countless similar moments. Each side carries memories of past encounters, both real and imagined, that inform present behavior. Yet this specific moment refuses to be fully explained by those memories. It demands attention to what is actually happening, not just what has happened before. This demand introduces the possibility of misinterpretation. If fear has been exaggerating threat, then past conclusions may warrant reevaluation. The encounter becomes a mirror reflecting not only the other side, but one's own readiness to assume the worst. This reflection is uncomfortable, challenging the moral simplicity that fear provides. It suggests that certainty may have been purchased at the expense of accuracy. Despite this, no clear alternative framework has yet emerged. Compassion, trust, and empathy remain abstract concepts, overshadowed by the practical realities of war. The shift occurring in this phase is not toward warmth, but toward complexity. The encounter becomes layered, resisting easy conclusions. Fear no longer dominates unopposed, but nothing has yet replaced it. The silence between actions grows heavier, filled with unspoken calculations. Each side waits for the other to confirm or disprove lingering assumptions. The absence of immediate violence becomes meaningful in itself, a data point that fear struggles to incorporate. This absence forces reconsideration. If hostility were absolute, why has it not already manifested? This question lingers without answer, unsettling the emotional equilibrium. The encounter begins to feel less like a confrontation and more like a suspension, a moment held open by indecision. Fear still whispers of danger, but its voice is no longer singular or absolute. It competes with observation, reason, and an emerging sense of shared vulnerability. By the end of this phase, fear has not been defeated, but it has been destabilized. Its grip has loosened just enough to allow other interpretations to surface. The encounter remains unresolved, but the trajectory has shifted. What began as a confirmation of threat has become an examination of assumption. The ground is prepared for change, not because fear has disappeared, but because it has been forced to confront its own limits. As the encounter reaches its next phase, the defining shift does not arrive through force or command, but through a deliberate choice that feels almost fragile against the backdrop of war. British humanity enters quietly, without ceremony, expressed through actions that resist the momentum of fear rather than confront it directly. This humanity does not announce itself as virtue. It appears instead as restraint, as patience exercised in circumstances where impatience would have been understandable and even expected. In this moment, the encounter begins to move away from instinct and toward intention. What distinguishes this shift is its ordinariness. There is no dramatic gesture meant to signal moral superiority, no symbolic act designed for remembrance. Instead, humanity manifests in small decisions that prioritize dignity over advantage. These decisions slow the encounter further, introducing a rhythm that contrasts sharply with the urgency of fear. Where fear demands immediate resolution, humanity allows space, and in that space, the encounter is subtly but decisively reframed. This reframing challenges the logic of war itself. War trains participants to see restraint as risk and compassion as weakness, yet here restraint becomes a form of control more powerful than aggression. By choosing not to escalate, British conduct asserts a different kind of authority, one rooted in confidence rather than dominance. This authority is not imposed, it is felt through consistency and calm, through the refusal to exploit vulnerability even when the opportunity exists. The moral weight of this choice becomes apparent almost immediately. The opposing side, conditioned to expect punishment or exploitation, is forced into a state of psychological disorientation. Fear had prepared them for violence, for humiliation, for loss. Instead, they encounter fairness that contradicts every expectation. This contradiction destabilizes not only their understanding of the situation, but their understanding of the people before them. The encounter is no longer defined solely by opposing roles, but by a shared presence within a moment that defies precedent. British humanity also carries an implicit message that war does not absolve individuals of ethical responsibility. By acting with restraint, the British response rejects the idea that circumstance alone dictates behavior. It asserts that even within conflict, choice remains. This assertion is not verbalized, but it is unmistakable in its effect. It reframes the encounter as a moral exchange rather than a purely strategic one. This shift introduces vulnerability of a different kind. To act humanely under threat requires confidence that one's values will not be exploited. It risks misunderstanding and miscalculation. Yet this vulnerability is precisely what gives the action its power. It demonstrates trust not in the other side's goodwill, but in the strength of one's own principles. The encounter becomes a test of character rather than reflex. As this humanity takes shape, the emotional atmosphere changes. Tension remains, but it is no longer fueled solely by fear. Instead, it is accompanied by uncertainty about how to respond to unexpected kindness. The opposing side must now reconcile their expectations with lived experience. This reconciliation is not immediate or comfortable. It challenges deeply held beliefs about the enemy and about survival itself. The British response also redefines the meaning of control within the encounter. Control is no longer exercised through intimidation, but through consistency and predictability. Humane treatment establishes boundaries that are firm yet fair, reducing the chaos that fear thrives upon. In doing so, it creates a new emotional framework within which the encounter unfolds. Actions are no longer interpreted exclusively as threats, but as signals of intent. This reframing has a cumulative effect. Each humane choice reinforces the last, building credibility through repetition rather than declaration. Over time, this credibility begins to outweigh fear's influence. The encounter transitions from a moment of potential violence to a moment of moral clarity, where the behavior of one side reshapes the expectations of the other. This clarity does not eliminate risk, but it transforms how risk is understood. British humanity also functions as a mirror. It forces the opposing side to confront their own assumptions and potential responses. Faced with dignity rather than cruelty, they must decide whether to reciprocate or resist this new dynamic. The encounter thus becomes reciprocal in a way it was not before. Responsibility is shared, even if unevenly, and the possibility of mutual recognition emerges. Importantly, this humanity does not deny the reality of war. It does not pretend that conflict has ceased or that danger has vanished. Instead, it coexists with vigilance, demonstrating that caution and compassion are not mutually exclusive. This balance is difficult to maintain, requiring constant awareness and discipline. Yet it is precisely this difficulty that underscores the moral significance of the moment. The encounter now carries a different emotional charge. Where fear once compressed perception, humanity expands it. The individuals involved begin to see beyond immediate survival, considering consequences that extend beyond the present moment. The encounter is no longer just about what happens next, but about what this moment represents within a larger narrative of conflict. British humanity introduces the idea that power can be exercised without dehumanization. This idea is radical in wartime, where power is often equated with the ability to inflict harm. By refusing this equation, the encounter becomes a quiet challenge to the norms of conflict. It suggests that strength can be measured not only by force, but by restraint exercised under pressure. As the encounter continues under this new framework, its significance deepens. What began as a tense meeting defined by fear now becomes a moment of moral reversal. The expected script has been interrupted, and in its place emerges a narrative shaped by choice. This narrative does not erase the realities of war, but it complicates them, introducing the possibility that even within violence, humanity can assert itself. by the end of this phase, the encounter has been irrevocably altered. Fear no longer defines its meaning. Instead, it exists alongside a powerful counterexample, that humane action can change not only behavior, but perception. British humanity has reframed the encounter, not through grand declaration, but through sustained ethical conduct. The moment stands as proof that even in the most hostile conditions, the decision to act with dignity can reshape everything that follows. The reframing of the encounter produces consequences that are immediate yet deeply disorienting. Once British humanity establishes itself as the governing force of the moment, the psychological balance shifts in ways that neither side had fully anticipated. The opposing side, conditioned by fear and expectation of cruelty, finds itself confronting a reality that refuses to align with the logic of war they have prepared for. This contradiction creates a profound internal rupture, one that unsettles certainty more effectively than violence ever could. What makes this phase significant is not the absence of threat, but the collapse of predictability. Fear had provided a clear narrative. Dominance would be asserted, weakness punished, survival determined by force. When this narrative fails to materialize, it leaves behind a vacuum. In that vacuum, the mind struggles to recalibrate. The encounter becomes psychologically unstable, not because danger has increased, but because the familiar markers of danger are no longer reliable. The moral reversal embedded in British humanity now asserts itself fully. Actions that once would have signaled control through intimidation are replaced by fairness and restraint. This reversal forces a reassessment of power itself. Power is no longer experienced as something imposed from above, but as something exercised through consistency and moral clarity. The opposing side must confront the unsettling realization that dominance does not always require cruelty, and that authority can exist without humiliation. This realization carries emotional weight. It undermines the defensive narratives that fear relies upon to justify aggression and suspicion. When the expected cruelty does not arrive, fear begins to lose its moral justification. The opposing side is left with a difficult question. If the other is capable of restraint and dignity, what does continued hostility signify? The encounter thus becomes not only a challenge to perception, but a challenge to identity. The psychological impact of being treated humanely under conditions where cruelty was expected is profound. It introduces a sense of moral dislocation, forcing individuals to confront the possibility that their assumptions about the enemy may be incomplete or flawed. This confrontation is uncomfortable, as it destabilizes the emotional armor built for survival. The encounter becomes a moment of exposure, where certainty gives way to vulnerability. British humanity also alters the emotional tempo of the encounter. Where fear once accelerated thought and action, humanity slows them down. This slowing is not passive, it is deliberate. It creates space for reflection, for recognition of shared vulnerability, and for the possibility that the encounter may carry meaning beyond immediate survival. In this space, reactions become choices rather than reflexes. The moral reversal extends beyond individual behavior to reshape the broader psychological environment. The opposing side begins to recognize that they are being seen not solely as a threat, but as a human presence within a specific moment. This recognition is subtle, but its effects are cumulative. It disrupts the binary logic of war, where one side's humanity is often denied to validate the other's actions. This disruption introduces a new form of tension. It is no longer the tension of imminent violence, but the tension of moral responsibility. Both sides are now aware that their actions will carry ethical weight. The encounter is no longer insulated by fear alone. It is exposed to judgment, memory, and consequence. This awareness heightens the significance of each decision, making neutrality impossible. British humanity also reveals its own fragility in this phase. Acting with restraint under pressure requires constant vigilance. It demands discipline to maintain fairness in the face of uncertainty. This discipline itself becomes a form of strength, one that contrasts sharply with the impulsive aggression fear often produces. The encounter thus becomes a demonstration of control exercised inwardly rather than outwardly. As the moral reversal settles, it begins to influence behavior on both sides. Gestures and responses are adjusted in recognition of the new dynamic. Communication, even when minimal, carries different implications. Silence becomes less threatening, movement less charged. The encounter does not lose its seriousness, but it gains a new dimension of mutual awareness. This phase also exposes the limitations of fear-based systems. Fear can initiate control, but it cannot sustain legitimacy once contradicted by lived experience. British Humanity exposes this weakness by offering an alternative model of interaction, one that proves effective without resorting to intimidation. The encounter becomes evidence that ethical conduct is not incompatible with security, but can enhance it. The opposing side's response to this reversal is not uniform. Confusion, suspicion, and cautious acknowledgement coexist. Some cling to fear as a familiar guide, while others begin to recognize the implications of humane treatment. This uneven response underscores the depth of the encounter's impact. Moral change does not occur instantaneously, it unfolds through internal struggle and gradual reassessment. As time passes, the encounter takes on a reflective quality. It becomes clear that something irreversible has occurred, even if its full consequences are not yet visible. The moral reversal has altered the trajectory of the moment, ensuring that it cannot be reduced to a simple exchange of power. It has become a reference point, a memory that will influence future interpretation and behavior. This phase is defined by transformation rather than resolution. The encounter has not ended, but it has been fundamentally redefined. Fear no longer occupies the center of meaning. Instead, it exists alongside an emerging recognition of ethical agency. The participants are no longer merely reacting. They are participating in the creation of a shared moral moment. In this way, the encounter transcends its immediate context. It becomes a demonstration of how moral choice can interrupt the momentum of conflict. The reversal does not erase danger or negate the realities of war, but it reshapes the psychological landscape in which those realities are navigated. The encounter stands as proof that humanity, once introduced, cannot be easily dismissed. By the end of this phase, the encounter carries a new gravity. It is no longer defined by what might happen, but by what has already changed. The moral reversal has taken hold, altering perception, behavior, and expectation. The encounter has become a turning point, not because of force exerted, but because of restraint maintained. What follows will be shaped not by fear's certainty, but by the lasting impact of humane choice. The consequences of the encounter do not end when the immediate moment passes. Instead, they begin to unfold quietly, extending outward in ways that are neither dramatic nor easily measured. What has occurred lingers in memory, reshaping perception long after physical separation restores distance. The fear that once dominated the encounter does not disappear, but it is permanently altered, now intertwined with the memory of restraint and fairness. This coexistence of fear and humanity creates a lasting tension, one that influences future expectations and behavior in subtle but profound ways. In the aftermath, trust does not emerge fully formed or confidently declared. It appears cautiously, almost reluctantly, as a possibility rather than a certainty. The opposing side carries forward the imprint of British humanity as a reference point, something that complicates future encounters. The knowledge that restraint was once chosen over cruelty introduces doubt into fear's once unquestioned authority. Even when fear resurfaces, it now faces competition from lived experience. This shift in memory is crucial. War relies heavily on simplified narratives to sustain itself, reducing complex realities into manageable oppositions. The encounter disrupts this process by introducing a memory that refuses simplification. It cannot be easily categorized as victory or defeat, kindness or weakness. Instead, it exists as an unresolved presence, forcing reflection rather than confirmation. The individuals involved carry this ambiguity with them, whether consciously or not. Over time, this memory begins to influence decision-making. When future situations arise that echo the conditions of the encounter, the mind returns to what was witnessed. The assumption that hostility is inevitable is no longer absolute. There is now precedent for an alternative response, one that demonstrated effectiveness without brutality. This precedent does not dictate action, but it expands the range of what feels possible. British humanity thus becomes a quiet standard against which future behavior is measured. It serves as a reminder that restraint is not synonymous with vulnerability and that dignity can coexist with control. This reminder operates beneath the surface, rarely articulated, yet persistently influential. It shapes not only expectations of the British, but expectations of oneself. The encounter invites a reassessment of what it means to act responsibly within conflict. The ripple effects extend beyond individual psychology into broader patterns of interaction. Stories are shared, memories recounted, interpretations exchanged. Each retelling alters the encounter slightly, but the core impression remains intact. Fear did not define the outcome. These stories function as counternarratives, challenging the dominant logic of war that frames all encounters as zero-sum struggles. They do not erase fear, but they complicate it. As these narratives circulate, they influence collective perception. The opposing side begins to associate British conduct not solely with power, but with a capacity for fairness that resists caricature. This association does not transform alliances or erase enmity, but it introduces nuance into a landscape that thrives on absolutes. The enemy becomes less abstract, more difficult to dismiss as purely malevolent. This nuance has practical consequences. In moments of uncertainty, hesitation may replace reflexive aggression. Caution becomes informed not only by fear, but by the possibility that restraint may again be encountered. This hesitation creates space for alternative outcomes, even if those outcomes are not immediately realized. The encounter thus continues to exert influence, shaping behavior through memory rather than command. The emotional impact of this shift is gradual and uneven. Fear still asserts itself, especially in moments of danger, but it no longer operates alone. It is accompanied by a quieter voice that recalls the encounter's moral reversal. This voice does not offer guarantees, but it introduces doubt into the inevitability of violence. Doubt, in this context, becomes a catalyst for reflection rather than paralysis. British humanity also leaves a mark on those who enacted it. Acting with restraint under pressure reinforces internal identity, affirming values through practice rather than ideology. The memory of choosing humanity over expedience becomes a source of quiet resolve. It shapes future conduct, not through obligation, but through confidence in the power of ethical consistency. The encounter becomes a personal reference point, a moment that affirms character. This internal reinforcement is significant as it strengthens the capacity to repeat such choices. Moral action becomes less extraordinary once it has been enacted successfully. The encounter demonstrates that humane behavior is not only possible under duress, but effective. This demonstration reduces the psychological barrier to future restraint, making ethical choice feel less like risk and more like responsibility. The long-term consequences of the encounter resist dramatic framing. There is no clear turning point where hostility dissolves into understanding. Instead, change manifests as a gradual erosion of certainty. Fear loses its monopoly on interpretation, making room for complexity. This complexity does not simplify the realities of war, but it humanizes them, reintroducing moral agency into environments that often suppress it. The encounter's influence also extends into how memory itself is structured. Rather than being archived as a moment of threat narrowly avoided, it is remembered as a moment of possibility realized. This framing affects how the past is recalled and how the future is anticipated. The encounter becomes a lesson not about survival alone, but about choice under pressure. In this way, the encounter contributes to a broader, if quieter, transformation. It challenges the assumption that ethical behavior is a luxury reserved for peace. By demonstrating humanity within conflict, it redefines what is considered realistic or practical. This redefinition may not alter the course of war, but it alters the moral landscape within which war is experienced. The ripple effects are not universal or uniform. Some dismiss the encounter as an anomaly, a rare deviation from a harsher norm. Others internalize it as evidence that norms themselves are more flexible than assumed. This divergence reflects the encounter's true significance. It does not dictate meaning, but invites interpretation. Its power lies in its capacity to provoke thought rather than enforce conclusion. As time passes, the encounter recedes into history, but its influence persists in altered expectations and remembered restraint. It demands attention to what is actually happening, not just what has happened before. This demand introduces the possibility of misinterpretation. If fear has been exaggerating threat, then past conclusions may warrant reevaluation. The encounter becomes a mirror reflecting not only the other side, but one's own readiness to assume the worst. This reflection is uncomfortable, challenging the moral simplicity that fear provides. It suggests that certainty may have been purchased at the expense of accuracy. Despite this, no clear alternative framework has yet emerged. Compassion, trust, and empathy remain abstract concepts, overshadowed by the practical realities of war. The shift occurring in this phase is not toward warmth, but toward complexity. The encounter becomes layered, resisting easy conclusions. Fear no longer dominates unopposed, but nothing has yet replaced it. The silence between actions grows heavier, filled with unspoken calculations. It becomes part of the invisible fabric of experience that shapes behavior in subtle ways. The fear that once defined the encounter's beginning is no longer sufficient to define its legacy. Instead, the legacy is marked by the enduring presence of humanity as a complicating force. Ultimately, the encounter's consequences lie not in immediate transformation, but in sustained possibility. It demonstrates that even within the rigid structures of war, moments of ethical clarity can occur and endure. These moments do not resolve conflict, but they humanize it, ensuring that fear never fully extinguishes the capacity for conscience. The encounter lives on not as a dramatic turning point, but as a quiet, persistent influence, reshaping how individuals remember, judge, and choose long after the moment itself has passed. In retrospect, the encounter assumes a significance that could not have been fully grasped in the moment itself. What initially appeared as a tense and uncertain meeting, shaped by fear and caution, gradually reveals itself as a quiet but profound illustration of transformation. Time allows distance, and distance allows meaning to surface. The encounter is no longer bound to immediate risk or survival. It becomes a point of reflection through which the moral contours of war are reconsidered. What endures is not the threat that once loomed, but the reversal that reshaped it. The most striking element of this final reckoning is the realization that the encounter did not change everything through force, negotiation, or strategy. It changed everything through choice. British humanity did not overpower fear. It redirected it. Fear remained present, but it no longer dictated the narrative. Instead, it was absorbed into a broader understanding of responsibility, restraint, and consequence. This reframing challenges one of war's most enduring assumptions, that violence is the most reliable means of resolution. As the memory of the encounter settles into history, it becomes clear that its impact lies in contrast. The beginning was defined by fear so absolute that alternative outcomes seemed impossible. The end, however, is defined by the recognition that inevitability was an illusion. The encounter demonstrates that even in environments designed to eliminate moral ambiguity, ethical choice can still assert itself. This recognition does not romanticize war. It complicates it, refusing to reduce it to instinct alone. The encounter's legacy is shaped by its refusal to offer simple conclusions. There is no triumphant resolution, no symbolic reconciliation that neatly resolves conflict. Instead, there is a lingering awareness that something important occurred precisely because it was understated. The absence of spectacle becomes part of its power. The encounter teaches that moral clarity does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it emerges through consistency, patience, and restraint exercised under pressure. This final phase invites reflection on the nature of strength. Strength, as revealed by the encounter, is not solely the capacity to dominate or destroy, but the capacity to endure uncertainty without surrendering conscience. British humanity demonstrated a form of strength that operates inwardly, requiring discipline and self-control. This strength does not eliminate danger, but it navigates danger without surrendering identity. In doing so, It redefines what victory can mean within the moral limits of conflict. The encounter also reframes the role of memory in shaping future behavior. Remembered fear often hardens into justification, reinforcing cycles of hostility. Remembered humanity, however, introduces friction into these cycles. It slows the rush to judgment, complicates narratives of absolute enmity, and preserves the possibility of ethical response even when circumstances discourage it. The encounter's memory becomes a quiet counterweight to fear's more aggressive impulses. As history absorbs the encounter, it becomes less about the specific individuals involved and more about the principle it represents. It stands as an example of how moral agency persists even when systems are designed to suppress it. This persistence does not rely on heroism in the traditional sense, but on ordinary decisions made with extraordinary consistency. The encounter reminds us that history is shaped not only by grand strategies and decisive battles, but by moments where restraint alters expectation. The moral reversal at the heart of the encounter also challenges the idea that humanity is fragile in war. Rather than being easily extinguished, humanity proves resilient, capable of reasserting itself even in hostile conditions. The encounter shows that ethical behavior is not an anomaly reserved for rare individuals, but a possibility available whenever choice remains. This possibility does not guarantee change, but it ensures that change is never entirely foreclosed. In the broader narrative of war, such encounters are often marginalized, overshadowed by larger events and clearer outcomes. Yet their influence is cumulative. Each moment where humanity interrupts fear contributes to a slow reshaping of norms, even if that reshaping is difficult to measure. The encounter becomes part of an undercurrent within history, influencing attitudes and behaviors in ways that resist easy documentation but endure nonetheless. The final understanding of the encounter is therefore one of quiet significance. It does not claim to have altered the course of war, but it alters how war is understood. It insists that moral choice remains relevant even when outcomes seem predetermined. This insistence is its lasting contribution, offering a reminder that individuals are never entirely absolved of responsibility, regardless of circumstance. As the story concludes, what remains is a sense of transformation without closure. The encounter does not resolve fear, nor does it eliminate conflict. Instead, it reframes both, demonstrating that fear can be confronted without being indulged, and that conflict can be navigated without surrendering humanity. This reframing becomes the encounter's true legacy, shaping how it is remembered and why it matters. The enduring lesson lies in the recognition that change does not always arrive through dramatic intervention. Sometimes it emerges through restraint that feels almost invisible at the time. British humanity changed everything not by rewriting the rules of war, but by refusing to let those rules erase ethical agency. In doing so, it left behind a story defined not by what was destroyed or conquered, but by what was preserved. In the end, the encounter stands as a testament to moral courage exercised quietly. It shows that even within the machinery of war, moments of conscience can alter perception and expectation. Fear defined the beginning, but it did not define the end. The end is defined instead by the realization that humanity, once asserted, cannot be undone. It remains present in memory, shaping interpretation and choice long after the immediate danger has passed. This is how everything changed, not through force, but through the enduring power of humane decision.